CAPI and your EMQ and everything aren't like dialed in, stop everything you're doing right now and fix that and make sure that's in place. And also a very sneaky setting on that page that says track events automatically without code. That is super dangerous. Try not to like over dramatize it, but like
today I'm joined with Brett Fish, who is a Pixel and CAPI expert, and it's a pretty funny story how this all started. It really all originated from me tweeting out a large thread that I made going over one of our new clients that we had gotten that just had a really, really bad Pixel issue where they were like triple firing of conversion events. Their data integrity was just completely a mess. I was surprised by how many people in the DTC community seemingly had this issue or just didn't exactly know how to correctly diagnose a Pixel issue or a CAPI issue, for example, or even have that all set up. So Brett was very generous and reached out and was like, hey, let's jump on a call and jam it out. So that's what we're doing right now. I have a few questions, but in general, I'd love for you to introduce yourself, Brett. Who are you and what do you do?
That's a great question because obviously I nerd out on Pixel and CAPI stuff. My name is Brett Fish. I'm the founder at an agency called SkySill, and then I'm also the founder at a firm called Tag Hero. A very long story short of the way Tag Hero came and why I'm on this call came to be is, in the early days of our agency, we saw a lot of the same issues that you were describing with issues with pixel fires and challenges. Couldn't find anyone to help us fix them. And we kept running up against walls with clients. And so finally we're like, okay, screw it. We're like going to figure this out ourselves and self-teach and find people who can help us with this. And we started doing some of that kind of work. And then we got pulled into a program called the Facebook Marketing Partners for Technical Services program, which is a mouthful, but essentially what we were is we were a Facebook vendor, paid Facebook vendor, helping their advertisers with their Pixel CAPI setup. CAPI wasn't as much of a thing at the beginning, but then later in that program it was. So we did dozens and dozens and dozens of those projects for really large brands all over the world. And then that program ended about 2 years ago. Meta shuttered that program and the demand was still there. We spun off Tag Hero just doing these technical projects. That's what we do. We help brands and agencies do auditing and troubleshooting of their tracking setups, implementation of Pixel and server event setups and things like that. Excited to jam on this with you, Max.
Yeah, wow, that's super cool just to hear the backstory there of kind of the OG program rolling out of Meta. I guess a curiosity question here of like, why do you think they shut it down?
My best guess is honestly with everything that happened in the iOS 14.5 aftermath world, like even if you had a perfect Pixel and CAPI setup, there were still so many questions and issues with data, how comprehensive and accurate it was and everything like that. The program had started before that, and I think they wanted everyone to get set up with the right signals, but I think they had bigger fish to fry and were like diverting resources and focus elsewhere after all that iOS kind of change happened, and that's my best guess. The demand's still definitely out there for help with it, so I'm sure lack of interest.
That makes sense, and that is intriguing to me because if you go on the Performance 5 and they just had the Meta Marketing Summit, the very first thing on the Performance 5 on the website is like, get your conversion API set up. So I'm kind of shocked to hear that they kind of took that out, but I guess more business for you on your own end, which is good.
Yeah. I mean, like the demand's definitely still there. I was watching the Performance Summit too, and I don't remember his name, but the gentleman on stage literally said, if your CAPI and your EMQ and everything aren't like dialed in, stop everything you're doing right now and fix that and make sure that's in place. And of course that made me smile. They've been really clear. It's funny, CAPI's been around for a long time in different iterations, but really became a thing in this post-iOS 14.5 world. But they've been really clear that that's a major focus. They've added some things to the UI and Events Manager that actually shows you how many more attributed conversions you're getting from having server events and all that stuff. So they've definitely prioritized it for sure.
And those things are all really important. So we can jump into it. I have a few questions for you that'll kind of guide us into the conversation around CAPI and Pixel. There's a lot of ways to screw up the setup, I'm assuming, right? I'm sure you've seen a lot of different ways. I feel like most of it comes from the Pixel, at least from my experience. For example, I've seen Pixel double firing, triple firing that we've talked about. It's pretty obvious when you go into Events Manager and you kind of see the server events are a lot lower than the Pixel events, or the Pixel events are heavily inflated. I've also seen Pixels under firing. So what are those common issues that you see with people's Pixel setup? And what are the recommendations that you have for people to step-by-step identify how to fix it from there? Because I think a lot of people are like I even have a client right now, Pixel is double firing and they are looking at their website, scouring everywhere, and they are just like, I don't even know what to do. Like, I don't know where it's going wrong. And I think that's where a lot of people get stuck.
Yeah, so I think the main issue that you see with Pixel stuff is too many cooks in the kitchen over time. Like, things have been added or cobbled together, or they were like using Google Tag Manager manager and then they weren't, and stuff like that. If we're talking e-commerce world, the majority of e-commerce stores are on Shopify. Luckily, Shopify has Facebook and Instagram app and their data integration, which works really nice if your Shopify setup is pretty out of the box. Or we see issues where over time things have been like hacked in and cobbled together, set up just because they needed it to work, and they did it kind of like without any documentation. Someone did it here and other people didn't know their kind of thing. That's what we see the most. And what we see is like they're using the integration, but they also have events hard coded into the website or into the theme code, like in Shopify, or they're using the integration, and I call the meta event setup tool the silent killer, because those events won't show up anywhere like website code or anything, but they'll still fire for meta on the site. So if you go into the settings in Events Manager and open Event Setup tool and open your website, like to always check if there's events set up in there. You can have events fire on like button clicks or text, and see so many situations where we just cannot. We see the same thing you do where the pixel's over firing and we've scoured the website code and we can't find it. It's coming from Event Setup tool. So that's one as well. Google Tag Manager is another usual suspect on when we're trying to locate where these things are coming from. The biggest issues are when they're all kind of cobbled together over time and there's not a clean history and legacy of like where stuff has been set up. As far as like brands and stores and people like troubleshooting, the Test Events tab in Events Manager is your best friend. Like go to your site, run through your funnel start to finish, do like a test transaction and see what fires. You can use the front end tool in the browser, the Pixel Helper and things like that. Test events in the Events Manager is what Meta is actually receiving. So that's always kind of the true north as far as what data and events are actually coming in. Test that and then see where their events are coming from. And there'll be indications. It'll say like manual setup or partner integration. There can be other clues like how many parameters are an event carrying and things like that that might point you. And then beyond that, it's some technical digging, some of the things that we taught, like I just mentioned.
I think you may have even solved my problem, because I'm like, wow, I didn't even think to look at the manual integration.
Double dip.
Yeah, that's actually a really, really good call out. And that's stuff that people are just not aware of. That's all really, really good and helpful information. So you would say for the most part, the most frequent thing that people get wrong is usually just having too many people in the kitchen. I see this all the time. Like you get a new client and they're like, yeah, I had this past developer and they did this thing, and then someone else did this. So it's kind of what gets lost in translation usually, and there's some snippet of code somewhere on the website, or that they used a manual integration with the event setup tool through that highlighting a button for a conversion event, for example, and that's not trackable in the direct code on the website. That's something that's in Events Manager.
Yeah, like situation that we just actually had was someone like just needed it to work, so they set up a bunch of events in Events Manager in the event setup tool, codeless, tool through Meta, and that person's no longer with the company, and like someone comes in and is like, our tracking is just hosed and they can't figure out what's going on, and they just set it up so it would work. They just kind of hacked something together, but no one really knows how it was done or when it was done or why. Those are the most common situations we see all the time, and like I said, it's common. That's the situation you're in. You're not alone. That's very common. There have been a lot of iterations of things. Even the Shopify tracking integration was different a year or two ago, and things have changed a lot, so it's common, but we see that all the time. It's just kind of too many people like adding things or changing things without like oversight and a plan and a history recorded of that.
The recording of it, I think, is something that definitely gets lost, is like actually tracking these changes at least somewhere in your business. This is kind of back end stuff that people just want to get out the way and then forget about it, but it's actually something at CTC we actually audit all of our different CAPI setups and make sure that the event match quality is up to par. And actually every once in a while, like go back and make sure something changed, because you could change something on the website that could totally screw up your pixel without really realizing it. And I see that happen definitely a lot. The next question I would have for you is, there are all these common issues and setups, but what does an ideal setup look like? Like what is the golden standard that you're shooting for as far as your pixel and CAPI setup? There's a lot of language in the Events Manager now that's a little bit confusing. There's the connection method, there's event match quality. Then when you click in those event match qualities, for example, there's event deduplication, there is the data freshness, and all these different best practices that I think are definitely a lot more on the developer side of things. Like usually I see all that and I'm like, all right, I want to make sure it's okay. I don't really understand what each little thing means. I was wondering if you could delve into what those mean a little bit.
Sure, and I'm going to go off the top of the dome visualizing myself in Events Manager as I will. First thing that we always look at when we hop into Events Manager is when you go down into the actual individual events detail, those graphs that come up of the event flow, that's where we start. And essentially what you want to see is tightly correlated line. There's two lines that it will show if you're set up with both browser and server events. Facebook or Meta also calls CAPI. Those lines should be tightly integrated, and the server line should always be equal to or slightly higher than the pixel/browser line. That's one of the first things we look at. that. The reason they stress CAPI and it's a focus is because Pixel via the browser has JavaScript code. So that can be disrupted by browser load errors, ad blockers, JavaScript blockers, like a whole bunch of other things where server events should not be subject to those things because essentially your website's capturing that. You have a server, it's connected to Meta, and it goes straight over. The proportion of those is always important. Like if you're getting more Pixel than server events, something is off. It's not always a problem. Like maybe you have a landing page where you're having pixel fires and you don't have CAPI events for it. It could be something like that, but that's a sign that there could be an issue. Always the first thing that we look at are those lines and the correlation between them. The other thing you just kind of want to do like as a quick spot check is that the events in their volume and their flow like line up with the funnel. You should not have more add to cart events than view content events. You should not have more purchase events than add to cart events. That should not be possible based on a user flow. Those are two kind of like easy, quick visual things when you're in the kind of the event overview. Then when we get into the actual event details, when you open up any one of those events and you go into the details that you mentioned, EMQ is that is a way of matching an event back to a user on their platform. And they use a bunch of different parameters to do that. One of the things that I think is misunderstood with EMQ is you have to remember that when the user's higher in the funnel, like let's say I just go to your website, you don't have my name or my email or my phone number or anything like that. I haven't submitted that information. At the early stages of the funnel, you're not going to be able to capture and track that stuff until you're like further down, probably at least a purchase, but like an ad payment method or something like that. Early stages of the funnel, it's going to use things like your IP address, an external ID, FBC and FBP parameters, which like get appended to the URL when you click from an ad to a website. Looks a little differently at each stage of the funnel, right? Like what is a good EMQ? And they've moved to that. It used to be an out of 10 rating and now it's more qualitative, like good or okay or great and stuff like that. Right. Higher up the funnel, there's less expectation of how much match data there is. And it gets higher and higher until you get to like a purchase event, which you should have like everything for a purchase event.
So your purchase event should essentially have at least a good score. And then it's possible that with higher events, for example, like a page view where they just land on your homepage, that could potentially have a little bit of a lower score, but that's okay because that might be the expectation.
Right, but to your point, I think another way of framing it, what is considered good for a page view is not considered good for a purchase. So it is relative to like that event and that stage of the funnel. If you're not passing with a purchase, like email and phone are two of the primary keys that they use to match, and then name. If you aren't passing those things with your purchase, you're not going to have like a good EMQ, whereas at the page view level, we probably don't have that information. So you can still have a good EMQ there, even though we don't have that data. So that's just one thing that I think is like kind of misunderstood about EMQ. And then of course, like if you're using like an integration like Shopify's, there's no manual levers to pull. You can't go in and tweak it and say, oh, I want to send this. Where if you have a manual set up in like Google Tag Manager or something, then you maybe can add certain parameters and grab certain things and add them. Yeah, so that's kind of the look with EMQ. And then the rest of the things in the detail are really mostly focused on server events. If you're not sending server events, you really won't see like data freshness and deduplication and all that. One of the biggest things I can give on the call about deduplication, then this is also like largely misunderstood. Best practice setup from the Meta standpoint is you are firing a pixel and a server event for every event. And then you're sending those to Meta and Meta is deduplicating them into one event. So you're not seeing two purchase events from Pixel and CAPI. You're seeing just that one event. The way that Meta deduplicates them is three factors. It's what kind of event it is, like a purchaser at add to cart, the general timing of that event coming in, and then also the event ID. And what happens is when you set up the integration through Shopify or we do a manual implementation, we attach a unique event ID to each event that goes to the pixel and the server event. It's like a long string that's randomized. But anyway, Meta will see that and say, oh, this is a purchase event, came from Pixel and CAPI, same event ID, deduplicate. When you go to that deduplication tab in Events Manager in the event details, that's when it's saying like what percent of Pixel events had an event ID, what percent of server events had an event ID, what was the overlap. That's what all those things. And then I think it also can look at like the FBP parameter and like an external ID maybe, but that's kind of how deduplication works. So it's really important that you have like that redundant setup and then that event ID is there to allow for deduplication. That's really what that whole screen is about. And then the data freshness is just how quickly your server events are sending to Meta. You want that as close to real time as possible for deduplication, for optimization. So like you don't want an event coming in and then like you're at a daily freshness and it comes in like the next day. That's not helping you. So most server setups, and like if you do it through Shopify are going to be in that real-time window, but you just want to be as close to like real-time on that as you want, just measuring kind of like the health and the speed of your server event.
This is fire information because you're kind of opening my mind up to things that I don't even know about. As you were speaking about, for example, event deduplication, I was looking in here and I'm like, okay, yeah, that's what that means. It makes sense now. That's really cool because like we talked about, the whole purpose of or reason of this interview, I feel like is like people just don't talk about this stuff enough. Like, and I feel like there's really like long convoluted developer language posts on it, but I think this is going to be really intriguing for people who just want to understand it a little more. And a question that I thought of while you were talking, we're looking at an account, for example, and we have a shitty event match quality score, right? Our EMQ is off for a purchase conversion event or any of the events. And this has directly to do, you were saying, with the coverage of the specific type of customer information that's been received. So when you're looking at the breakdown, what is like a typical reason, for example, in this account I'm looking right now that has a screwed up EMQ for purchase conversions, they have like 5.88% phone numbers hashed. How do you fix an issue like that when you're clearly just not getting the data and it's causing issues in your ad account? Where does that come from typically? Probably varies in some scenarios on what the setup is. And I know you mentioned like Google Tag Manager, you can make sure that you're custom coding in so that certain events will get fired. But in most circumstances, are there like typical things you see that go wrong?
There's a couple main things. One is totally dependent on your setup, because like if you're using an integration like the Shopify, and I just mentioned that one a lot because like the majority of commerce merchants are on Shopify, right?
Oh yeah.
That one's pretty good. As far as like Shopify in its platform with the app knows like where you enter your phone number when you're making a purchase, and it knows how to map that field. So we usually see those like go pretty well. The two main things with that are one is also in the settings when you go to your events manager for your Pixel, and you go to settings, there is a toggle for turning on automatic advanced matching on your Pixel. You always want to toggle that on with the one like preface, like if you're in a sensitive vertical like healthcare or finance or something, you have to be careful, because essentially what that allows the Pixel to do is say, I'm going to go on your site, and if I think this is PII that we should send, we're going to automatically send it. And you have to be a little careful in sensitive verticals, but for any like most e-com and stuff, you should have that on, and you should be allowing the Pixel setup to find that information and send it back automatically. The other point is when you're doing your server setups, especially if you're doing it in like Google Tag Manager, you can also implement what's called manual advanced matching, which is you actually code into the Pixel code. You use like FN is the short, like a parameter, like anything else that comes with the event, like the value or the monetary amount or the product ID. You can attach like first name, last name, phone, email, and map those to variables on your site. So if a user goes in and enters their phone number, you can grab what that variable is and say, this is the phone number, this is the email, manually in the code. And there's some nuance to kind of that setup, but those are the two main things, is like the automatic and the manual matching. And then of course, if you're using one of the main integrations, those should be handling those things. If they're not, then odds are that there's probably something custom or outside of the box with your setup, like in Shopify, and it's not mapping that field. That gets into like theme dev stuff to make that work. But that's like the typical stuff that we see.
That's really, really good advice. And the automatic advanced matching is a big thing just as a media buyer. One of the very first things that we do when we go into accounts, when we get new clients, is go, all right, what's going on in Events Manager? We go in, usually automatic advanced matching is off, and we just flip that on. And that's really as easy as going to your Events Manager, going to settings, scrolling down, and then just switching them on. And that can drastically change performance, which is pretty crazy.
While you're on that tab, and I didn't mention it earlier with the event setup tool, there's also a very sneaky setting on that page that says track events automatically without code. That is super dangerous from like our standpoint, not to like over dramatize it, but like, because what you're doing is you're telling the Pixel, hey, if you see anything on this website that you think is a good event, go ahead and fire that back. Now, usually it doesn't necessarily mess with like the prime e-com funnel events, like add to cart and purchase and stuff like that. But we have seen situations where it's firing like initiate checkout events. Just while you're on that tab in the settings of the events manager, turn that off. Like we always recommend and want our tracking to be very deliberate and not just kind of leaving it up to the platform to say, oh, I think this is an event we should send. And we want it firing at the right stages where it's meant to be. So I wanted to make sure that's another one of like the silent killer ones that if it's on can cause problems.
Yeah, it's on right here in this account. So I think that's actually one that must be a big misunderstanding, because I think I saw a tweet thread recently that was recommending that you turn it on, but they didn't go into any sort of reasoning behind the integration of why. They were just like, yeah, it just helps or something. So that's actually really intriguing, because I don't think people talk about that enough. And it is crazy how, I mean, that one little button in the settings page can have like a massive difference for your business, and also potentially save you from being being in trouble for some sort of data reasoning. I know in California, there are like data tracking things that you need to be aware of and make sure that you're not passing certain events thing. We had a client recently that was like, hey, we need to turn off specific events that we can't track, or specific, I guess, what would you call them? Identifiers for a customer, for example, like your email or gender or where they're from. So that's really, really good information.
I'll have to look at that thread too, because like in regard to how it would help, like our thing has always been, we only want our events firing exactly when we want them firing and exactly in the way and with the information that we want deliberately. And whether that's through like an app integration that's already built for the platform or we're doing it manually, we've never seen a good use case to just leave it up to the platform to fire events back. So I'll have to dig more into that. But from my experience, I've never seen a situation where that's like a helpful thing to have enabled.
Sounds like it's opening up a can of worms that can potentially get you in trouble or just screw up your setup because you're letting Facebook have too much, I guess, reign over what your setup is. So you mentioned the Shopify integration as being like the best practice for CAPI integration and also for Pixel setup. It's just super easy, streamlined, and we definitely recommend most of our partners just use that. But I've heard of a lot of people recommending other things. Is there like a top tier setup that you recommend? Like, is there something that is even better than that, or any particular setup that's a non-Shopify setup that you recommend for people who are like on BigCommerce or on WooCommerce or something different? The most frequent issues that I always see is when someone doesn't have a Shopify store, it's like almost a guarantee that something's going to be screwed up with their CAPI or their Pixel. It's kind of comical because it just always happens. What's your recommendation to those people who are like, crap, I'm not on Shopify, I need help? Sure. What do you usually recommend there?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. To start, the reason, and I think better is relative, like the Shopify the integration works great because it's super fast, it's easy, you get browser and server events. TikTok actually announced that their app will also be doing server events now as of the end of June.
That was like today.
That just dropped. So that's great too. Just from ease of use, I authored a piece a while back because there's a bunch of third-party tracking tools, and my take was Shopify data, is it 100% squeezing every last drop out of every last piece of data that you could possibly be getting? Maybe not, but the data is good and the setup is good. At like Meta and Shopify have worked closely together to like make all this work well. I'd say from ease of use, the fact that it's free, you don't have to pay for a server, a bunch of other reasons, it just makes a lot of sense to use it, and it works well. We do see situations where like a Shopify merchant will need events that aren't. The one thing with the Shopify integration, it's going to cover those like main e-commerce events, but if you have anything else you're trying to do, it's not built to handle that. So, if you have like lead capture or other things that you want to track, that's where sometimes there's the other options. The other thing is, you can look at tools like Popsicle or Elevar. There's a bunch of other third-party tracking tools that are available if you want to enhance your data. Usually I would recommend that for stores that are like really high volume, really high traffic. There's lots of money on the line because there's a lot of data and there's a lot of user data and stuff like that. There's solutions out there. I would say for the majority of merchants, the integration works pretty well. On the other side of it, you mentioned BigCommerce. Magento is always another one where it's always just seems to be a nightmare. We actually just had a client who's migrating to BigCommerce, and like their integration is just not working for us. So we did a full build out for them in Google Tag Manager. That's usually what we use if we're not using an integration, for the simple reasons of that Google Tag Manager is free. It works really well. We can do both the Pixel browser event and server setup in Google Tag Manager. So Google Tag Manager has a server side to it that we can set that all up in Google Tag Manager. That's typically where we go if we're not on Shopify and if we're like e-commerce or Magento. WordPress has one called Pixel Your Site. It's a plugin. That plugin works pretty well for browser and CAPI, and if you're using WooCommerce and stuff like that on WordPress. But we also see a lot of WordPress clients that go the Google Tag Manager route as well. That's kind of our go-to if we're not using the integrations typically.
That makes a lot of sense. That's really helpful. And when you say Google Tag Manager, because I know there's all sorts of third-party setups that actually you have to pay a certain amount for all of the volume of the conversion events coming through. Is that something you have to pay for on Google Tag Manager as well? Or is that like another kind of reintegration? Where are the server events kept, I guess, is my question, in a Google Tag Manager integration?
Yeah, great question. So Google Tag Manager in and of itself is free, and there's two kind of containers in Google Tag Manager. There's web containers, which is like pixel tags and all your web tracking tags, and then you can create server containers where you can actually put server tags and stuff in there. With Google Tag Manager, with any other solution, you're probably going to have to pay for your server. Typically with like Google Tag Manager, we're using Google Cloud Platform, which is a cloud server platform. You can connect to it it pretty easily. The amount you pay is directly correlated to how many calls, how many server calls and events you're sending through in your volume. And it's not a huge fee. I would say most stores land in the $50 to $100 a month range. I think if you're going that setup and you're doing enough data, it's not a huge price to pay for like server track.
It's not too bad. It's really a drop in the bucket in the scheme of things if you're really running like a fully functional e-commerce store.
And that's the nice thing about the Shopify integration. Some of the other ones I was talking about is you don't have to pay those server fees. Shopify is essentially allowing you to use their servers to send your events to Meta, and you're not paying a fee for that. Anywhere else, pretty much you set up. Meta also has a tool. Admittedly, we don't use it a ton. It's called Conversion API Gateway.
Yeah, I've tried to use that before.
It was their attempt to try to make it easier to, like, some of the stuff I was just talking about with Google Tag Manager. It's not the easiest thing to set up. Like, I have a team that we do a lot of these projects and we specialize in it kind of, and they know how to do it, but it's not always the easiest thing. So they tried to introduce that product to make it like an easier process of setting up CAPI events without having to go through Tag Manager and devs and stuff like that. I don't find it super intuitive, and you still have to usually set up like an AWS server, an Amazon server to handle those same server events like we were just talking about. And you're still setting up that AWS account and paying for it and everything. So it is an option. We usually steer clients and just say, let's just do it in GTM. You own it, you control it. You have to pay for the server anyway, and we usually kind of steer them that direction. And there's some upfront setup, but once it's set up, there's not really much ongoing maintenance to it. Yeah.
Actually, really funny you mentioned that, because a long while ago, I was trying to manually do a setup for somebody who just couldn't get their pixel set up. And it was a unique situation similar to what you said, where the web custom conversion event, the event wasn't something that was on the website. It had to be a custom conversion event. It was for a donation type website, and we couldn't figure it out. It ended up being a whole nightmare of like a long setup through CAPI Gateway, right? Yeah. And it's like a super simple drop down, and they're like, all right, this is going to be really easy. And like most things on Facebook, I guess it's not. Yeah, I remember I did the whole AWS server, and it just wasn't working, and we ended up going another route. I think it's good to steer people in the right direction of like what's going to be best for them. And financially, I mean, Shopify just seems like a great option. They've really got that whole integration just streamlined in a super easy to use way.
Yep. And I remember when we were part of that Meta Technical program, for a long time we were doing like that manual events matching code implementations in Shopify. That was like a very common project we were working on. And I remember when they announced that now the automatic advanced matching with Shopify, we didn't need to do manual anymore because they'd integrated the Meta and the Shopify platforms tightly enough now where just the automatic advanced matching would pull everything over, no need for the manual side. That platform's definitely set up for best foot forward for like simplicity and still achieving like, you know, a pretty good and best practice meta tracking setup for sure.
That's awesome. It's super cool to hear that insider info, I guess, of someone who really worked on all that stuff. Yeah. It's so sick, man. So we're probably wrapping up because I don't have too many more questions to ask, but I guess to wrap up, are there any other main things that you would call out to like people who are trying to figure out what to do with their Pixel and CAPI setups if they can't get it to work? Obviously, you're a great person to reach out to if they need help. Are there any things that you steer away from? For example, I know a lot of like Fiverr setups and like Upwork, and like there's a lot of things out there of people who claim to be good at it. So are there any like red flags that you would be able to call out for if you're talking to someone who's going to set it up? I know that's a tough question probably, but
no.
Yeah.
And the best way I can answer it is like part of the reason we created Tag Hero was because it's, even if you find someone on Fiverr or Upwork, it can take a while and it can be like a hassle and a process, and like who has time, right? To like vet contractors and search and all that. I mean, the reason we started Tag Hero was to be like a known, just like these people, these guys do these projects. That's all they do. They know them inside out. They're going to get in, they're going to fix stuff and be done. Time is the most valuable thing. And that's why we started it. So you can probably find people. I mean, you know, this stuff isn't necessarily like rocket science level stuff as far as like engineering and coding, but you do need kind of a specific person that both understands the platform and the platform requirements and, you know, specifics, and also has some dev skills and dev background. They're kind of unicorns, and I have found some of them and they work with me at Tag Hero, but like you might be able to find those people, but it could be kind of a hassle in the process. So leverage like Twitter, like ask questions, and maybe you can get someone to help. If you get stuck and you're like, I need to get this solved, you can always reach out to us at Tag Hero. That's what we do. But yeah, I mean, those platforms might have people that can do it, but more often than not be like quite the process to actually land on someone that you're going to trust and bring in and like grant access to your pixel and your backend.
Totally.
Like,
Yeah, and it's a big deal. They need to get access to the whole back end of your Facebook ad account essentially, and that can go horribly wrong for numerous reasons. So
or even to your Shopify store. I mean, like in a lot of situations, they have to grant us full staff account access to the back end of their e-commerce store, so we can like check their website code and the theme files and stuff like that. And so trust is a big element there as well.
Absolutely. I've even been there, actually. I've dealt with random people off Fiverr who I've tried to help out with an integration. And the one that I did not work, actually. And it took like 2 weeks and we just literally didn't get anywhere. Yeah, if you're watching this and you are having an issue, definitely make sure you reach out to someone who's like a professional and knows what's going on, and don't give access to some random people, I guess. So that's really good advice. I guess we could leave it at there if there isn't anything else top of mind that you'd want to share before we dip.
No, I think that's about it. We dove in pretty hard. I will say, like, on the Twitter thread, I made a sort of a commitment. I thought like some of the ideas people had about making some videos were a great idea. I'm committed to doing that. Tag Hero hasn't existed very long as like an entity. We've only been around for like 5 or 6 months. So I think we're going to try to make a video series of like screen grabs of like walking through this and auditing Pixel setup to help people give that. And then we can always do a follow-up. Max, if there's like questions or comments or like anything comes up, always glad to have a follow-up.
Yeah, absolutely. I would be so stoked to do that. I love this connection being here. And in general, just from a YouTuber and lover of the internet standpoint, I think that would crush. I think that would be a great thing, both from your own business standpoint, of course. I think that's what the people want. I was just shocked at how many bookmarks there were on my tweet. I was like, I guess people really are just like kind of at a loss for words as what to do when it comes to this type of stuff. Sure. And even myself, I mean, I'm by no means an expert. Like you make me look like a noob here when I'm talking about these things. And it's something that's so important, though, to your Facebook ad account. Like I said in my initial tweet, this can ruin your ad account without you even knowing, because people just don't know. And you're running your ad, wondering why you're getting like a lot of conversions, but it's not showing up in your Shopify store. There's just not real. And your data integrity is the most important thing that you can have when you're running Facebook ads or an e-commerce store in general. Definitely want to get it right. And I'm going to be looking forward to seeing all those videos. That's going to be some great content.
We'll get to work on it.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining me. If you're watching this, definitely give Brett a follow on both Twitter, and also make sure you follow his agency's channel if that exists on YouTube yet. Do you have one of those yet? We do not have a
Tag Hero YouTube channel yet. It's all like your tweet and thread like started all this conversation. Nice. So like we're gonna get to work on it. We're wrapping up some projects and then we'll get to work on it.
Nice. Well, I'm looking forward to that, and I'm definitely going to be shouting you out in this whenever this is all up and done and stuff.